around this session. You know, we've had years where there has not been a lot to talk about. This is not one of them. It is a target-rich environment, as you saw from the 2 truths and a lie that we had. But what I'm going to talk about today is something that a lot of you might not pay attention to every year. It's this rulemaking, the physician fee schedule final rule. So I have to start with a disclaimer. I'm not giving statements on behalf of my firm or any clients. This isn't legal advice. These are my thoughts and my thoughts only. So let's start with making sure that everyone knows what the physician fee schedule rule is. So every single year, sometime in July, CMS issues a bunch of rules around how the Part B program is going to be implemented for the next calendar year. And 2 of those rules are the physician fee schedule proposed rule and the outpatient prospective payment system and ambulatory surgical center proposed rule. That's a mouthful. But both of those rules, among other things, talk about how drugs will be paid for under the Medicare Part B benefit for the next calendar year. So in this case, calendar year starting 2026. Feel free to take pictures of my slides. Just contact me on my team later and we will get you the slides so you don't have to worry about them. All right, so those rules came out in early July. The comments are already done. The comments were due on the physician fee schedule last Friday. The comments on the OPPS ASC rule were due yesterday, so it's done. Now, why do we care? Well, usually these rules don't do much that's relevant to this community, and certainly not on the ASP calculation. In fact, the last time this rule really made any substantive changes to the ASP calculation was in December 2006 for implementation in 2007, so also known as 19 years ago. So people don't expect much. And when there is going to be something in this rule, a lot of times there's some signaling that it's going to come out. Didn't have that this year. And this year, though, there's a lot. And there's a short deadline, and a lot of people have not focused on it, in my opinion, the way they should. So why is it different? Well, the physician fee schedule proposed rule has provisions that significantly impact not just how you're going to be calculating ASP as soon as Q1, but also potentially the Medicaid program. I had a lot of people who are like, not my problem. I don't have a Part B drug. I don't have to pay attention to that. It's going to soon be your problem one way or another. So you don't get to ignore it for that reason. And because of those changes to the ASP calculation, it is going to fundamentally impact the entire Part B buy and bill model. This model of manufacturers selling into the channel, monitoring how much physicians and hospitals are paying for their products, and making sure that the payment rate under Part B more than covers that, so that the doctors aren't so-called underwater and losing money. Because guess what? Healthcare providers aren't in the business of losing money on the products that they administer to their patients. So if the Part B payment rate is not going to exceed their acquisition cost, they're not going to prescribe it, they're not going to use it, and patient access is impacted. And that's what we're going to see here, or at least we're at significant risk of seeing ASP declines to the point that docs are going to be underwater and patient access is going to be threatened. It's also going to affect all of your supply chain contracting. Any agreement where you are paying a fee to a vendor or to someone in the supply chain is something that you're going to have to review and probably amend. And of course, also all of your GP documentation, processes, and programming. And that's just to start. And we have this very short trigger for getting it done. Because this rule comes out in July, it tends to be finalized around Halloween. No symbolism implied there. Maybe the first week of November. And the reason for that is this is a major rule, and it goes into effect January 1, and so you really need 60 days. That sounds like a lot. It's really not. 60 days notice to get your ducks in a row and be prepared for implementation to go live in Q1. And then that's just for ASP. All of these changes have implications for Medicaid. We don't have a Medicaid rule yet. We don't know if we're going to get a Medicaid rule. We don't know if the Medicare side is going to talk to the Medicaid side and port those changes over. And so if these changes impact just Part B and not Medicaid, to the extent that you have an agreement that spans both products, to the extent you have a product that spans both calculations, you could end up having to do things differently because you could have a regulatory requirement on the Part B side that is materially different than the regulatory standard for Medicaid. And you have 60 days to figure that out. I had a really hard time getting companies to focus on this when it first came out, because they tend to say, oh, it's this ASP thing, the GP team will figure it out, not my problem. It's your problem if your end customers are going to be disincentivized from prescribing the medicine and making sure that patients get it because they're going to be underwater. It's the business's problem if you're going to have to revise all of your agreements and amend them to account for the new regulatory requirements that you could see by the first week of November. And so if you have not yet spoken to your market access team, your trade team around what this rule could do to your business model, please do so. It's like cheerful, Tuesday morning news. So we're going to talk about 3 issues that in this rule, just 3. There are actually more, but the 3 issues we're going to talk about are proposed changes to the bona fide service fee definition, proposed codification for the first time ever of a bundled sale definition for purposes of the ASP calculation, and also a new requirement for mandatory submission of your ASP reasonable assumptions, and not just that, but also some documentation around your service fees. What do those 3 things have in common? They all have analogs on the Medicaid price reporting side of things, and we don't have a rule to change that yet. We don't even know if one's in the offing. But all 3 of those are things that, in general, manufacturers treat consistently across the calculations. But there's more. There are a bunch of topics that are in that rule that we're not going to get to, but I am confident that one of the 2 fireside chats, either today or tomorrow, will talk about some of those issues. So let's talk first about bona fide service fees. So the issue, I'm going to go through the slide and then we'll pause and we'll talk through it. The issue is that bona fide service fee test, which started in ASP world and was ported over to the Medicaid world around 2007, currently requires, among other things, that to be a bona fide service fee, they have to represent fair market value. CMS has never previously detailed a specific methodology that you have to use for determining fair market value, and manufacturers have requested guidance around it, and CMS has consistently said, no, we're going to leave it up to you because you're going to know best what works best. And not just you, but the fair market value vendors that you employ who are professionals. Like, that's what they do for a living, is figure out how to measure fair market value, and they wanted them to have flexibility to use the right methodology. What has CMS proposed? CMS has proposed 3 things. The first, that there is a specific fair market value methodology that you have to use depending on the fee structure. So for fees that vary directly with the amount of drug sold or the price of the drug, you can only determine fair market value using a cost of service methodology plus a reasonable markup. And that has to be determined using an independent FMV valuator. For fees that don't fall into that category, which we all know is the tiny, remainder, because virtually all service fee arrangements and admin fee arrangements that I see are percentage-based. Everything else, you can use a market-based methodology or cost-based if you'd like. So that's first, is you are constrained in the fair market value methodology you can use. Second, you have to renew that fair market value assessment at least as frequently as the renewal of the agreement. So if you have automatic annual renewals, you will have automatic fair market value refreshes from your vendor, which we all know, even when you do them at year 2 or year 3, they don't move a whole lot. So this is an administrative and a regulatory compliance burden that you would have. And third, you have to submit documentation of your fair market value assessment with those new mandatory reasonable assumption submissions. So those are the 3 new requirements. Now let's talk about them a little bit. First of all, this methodology of using cost-based approach, that is going to end up being the dominant approach because, as I just said, most of these fee arrangements that we see that you deal with every day are percentage-based. There are some that are not, but the vast majority of them are. My hypothesis is that if you go back and look at the fair market reports you have on those fees, most of them are not exclusively based on cost, if based on cost at all. And the reason for that is that the cost-based methodology doesn't work particularly well when there are strong market forces in play. What do I mean by market forces? 3 big wholesalers who control a lot of the market, for example. Certain PBMs who control a lot of the market. I don't know any manufacturer that pays a higher percentage-based fee than they would like to. When I ask them that, they say, we have no choice, this is the price we were given, this is what we have to pay. In that circumstance, it is a much greater likelihood, if you have to use a cost-based methodology, that some part of that fee is not going to qualify as fair market value. And under this proposed rule, that will now be a discount in your ASP. At least that amount. One of the points of clarification is asking CMS to confirm that only the marginal amount above fair market value has to be counted as a price concession. We hope CMS confirms that, because it would make no sense that the part that is fair market value you have to include, but we need CMS to confirm that. And so I'm in particular worried about manufacturers with smaller portfolios, because they inevitably pay higher service fees than large pharmas. And under this proposal, I think it is increasingly likely that their ASPs are going to be negatively impacted compared to their peers simply because they do not have the market power to negotiate a lower fee. And that's because if you think about the cost of distributing a drug, it's really, and the drugs, 2 Part B drugs have the same WAC, the cost of distributing that drug is probably not different for a distributor to incur, whether it's a small pharma or a large pharma. But the rates that can be charged those different companies can be very different. And the result is that additive amount is going to be lowering the ASP for the smaller manufacturer. So I have serious concerns. I would also note that in this proposal, CMS doesn't explain why this is the only methodology that can be used, why that's reasonable, why it's appropriate. They just declare that as the requirement. Next, I mentioned fair market value assessments with the renewal of the agreement. That's going to make everyone look very closely at the renewal terms of their agreement because of the added costs you're going to incur by having to redo those fair market value assessments. And last but not least, this fair market value documentation requirement maybe isn't that hard, maybe you have that, but one thing you do want to make sure is that your agreements with the fair market vendor allow you to disclose that to CMS. So think about all of your agreements that you evaluate currently for bona fide service fees, and do they satisfy all 3 of these requirements? If, assuming it's finalized as proposed, we hope it's not, but assuming it's finalized proposed, think about all of those agreements that are subject to fair market value determinations. Do they satisfy all 3? My guess is that no one has an agreement that solves all 3. And if not, you're going to have to revise your agreement in time to apply to fees incurred as to Q1 sales under this timeline. My last question, I'm going to ask this on every single slide, is do the non-fair market value fees under this methodology lower provider acquisition costs? Do they lower provider acquisition costs? Would it be appropriate to lower the reimbursement rates for providers and hospitals if a distributor fee exceeds fair market value, if a GPO fee exceeds fair market value, if a PBM fee exceeds fair market value? That's what they're proposing to do. Because as we understand it, CMS has basically been given marching instructions to lower costs. And so that's what they're doing here, and they're not, and they're doing it without regard, I would say, to the ASP statutory definition, which says it is only meant to measure the price to purchasers. These are purchasers, but they're not the providers who are actually going to be reimbursed based on that ASP. Okay. That's the first of 3 issues under the bona fide service fee definition. The second is the pass-through prohibition prong. You will also remember that the bona fide service fee definition provides that even if it's for a bona fide service on behalf of the manufacturer that's fair market value, no amount of that fee can be passed on in whole or in part to a customer or client of the fee recipient. That's what the definition is. And CMS's policy to date, the slide says previous, it really should say current. Their current policy, until this is finalized, is that you are allowed to presume in the absence of evidence to the contrary that no passing on is occurring. What is CMS proposing? That you can no longer presume, and not only can you not presume, but you must get a certification or a warranty that the fee is not being passed on to any client or customer or affiliate. They've added affiliate to the entities who cannot be a recipient in whole or in part of the fee. And that pass-through certification from the fee recipient is going to have to be submitted with your reasonable assumptions and your fair market value documentation. So that's a new requirement. Now, some agreements with GPOs in particular, but other fee recipients as well, might have what I have always called a pass-through prohibition in it, where the GPO or whomever says, we certify that we aren't passing through any component of this fee to any customer or client. But a lot of agreements don't have that in it. So if your agreement doesn't have it in it, if it doesn't include the term affiliate, you're going to have to amend that agreement in time to apply to sales in Q1. And you're going to have to make sure that that agreement provides for your ability to obtain that certification every single quarter from the fee recipient and submit it to CMS. And again, I would have you make an inventory of all your agreements where you're paying bona fide service fees now, or fees that you consider bona fide service fees, and say, does it have the language in it that I'm going to need to comply? And if it doesn't, you're going to need to go to that partner, assuming they'll agree, get this language added, and have it done in time to apply to your Q1 sales. Last but not least, the presumption against bona fide actually, one more thing I'm going to say back here, because I forgot to ask this question here. Does this, if fees are passed through, do these fees reduce physician or provider acquisition costs? Maybe. Sometimes I could see if a GPO passes back some of the fee to the hospital members, you could say it reduces their acquisition costs. But if they pass it to an affiliate or someone else, if it's just a pass-through to a third-party vendor that they relied on to help them perform the service, does that reduce the provider or the hospital's acquisition cost? I'd say no. But it's going to reduce their reimbursement rate come 2026. All right, presumptions against bona fide service fee status. So CMS has repeatedly been asked, do you think this service fee do you think this type of service is bona fide? Do you think that type of service is bona fide? And they've said, no, we're going to stay out. We want you to figure out what's reasonable, and we want you to have the flexibility to do so as models change over time. Again, in a new development, CMS is making two proposals. The first is in the text of the proposed regulation. The second is not in the text of the regulation, it's in their preamble, and I'll explain why that difference matters. So in the regulatory text, CMS stakes out a position that percentage-based fees or fixed fees designed to approximate percentage-based fees are presumed to be price concessions, unless you can otherwise qualify them as bona fide. So you may remember under the ASP regulation and the ASP statute, it provides for, I think, 5 categories of price concessions that Congress denominated as having to be considered in ASP. And it gave the Secretary authority to add to that list through regulation. The Secretary has never done so. In the regulatory text now, though, CMS is proposing that it's going to say you reduce ASP for chargebacks, rebates, prompt pay discounts, so on and so forth, and percentage-based fees, unless they can otherwise be determined to be bona fide service fees. So it's going to be its own non-bona fide fees are going to be its own category price concessions. And again, with a target on percentage-based fees, which again makes up the vast majority of fees that manufacturers pay today. So they're basically creating a presumption that any percentage-based fees is going to lower ASP, and that's problematic. But then in the preamble, they also target 4 categories of fees that aren't in the regulatory text. They say credit card fees, fees paid for cell collection and tissue procurement, particularly around cell and gene therapies, think apheresis, things like that. Those are presumptively non-bona fide. Certain data sharing fees, they talk about fees that manufacturers pay to get the data they need to validate rebate payments. And then, I love this, certain fees for distribution services that we just think exceed fair market value. Like, what the heck does that mean? What does certain mean? How are we supposed to know what certain means? Now, these are just in the preamble, and here's why this matters as a legal matter. When something's in the regulatory text and it goes through this notice and comment process that we're going through today and it's finalized, the language of the regulation effectively acts like law. It's binding, you have to comply. If it's in the preamble, it's just CMS's point of view. But it's a pretty strong point of view from an administration that's telegraphing very clearly that they're going to be enforcing it. So what do you do with that? What do you do with that? I mean, there have been a lot of comments on it, but it's not in the regulation. I don't know why it's not in the regulation. Is it a good thing or bad thing? We can debate that. But watch that space. These are not added to the list of 6 price concessions with chargebacks and rebates. They're not proposing to add credit card fees, cell and tissue collection fees. These are just in guidance, and so it really creates a lot of uncertainty for manufacturers. And again, I'd ask you the question, if these are counted in ASP, are they actually reducing the provider or physician's acquisition costs for the product at issue? So, why should you care? First and foremost, there is going to be enormous downward pressure on ASP erosion, and that means less patient access. Like, this is less patient access for patients under Medicare Part B and for any Medicaid program or other commercial payer that relies on ASP to set reimbursement rates. Because as we've just marched through those changes, the clear goal is reduced ASP without regard to whether it actually reduces provider or hospital acquisition costs, and that's going to narrow the margin, and it's going to make it prohibitive, has the potential to make it prohibitive for hospitals and providers to do that. Tiny silver lining is it could reduce your Part B inflation rebates, because this lower ASP in the current period is going to be lower relative to the benchmark ASP rate, but that's a pretty tiny silver lining given the patient impact. AMP and BP implications. We have virtually identical definitions of bona fide service fee between Medicare and Medicaid right now. Will these changes carry over? If they do, when do they carry over? We have no rule coming out of Medicaid anytime soon. What happens when you're calculating your January AMP and your Q1 ASP and you have different definitions? Do you treat them differently? If you don't treat them differently, are you enforcement risk because they haven't adjusted the Medicaid definition, but they have adjusted the ASP definition? And one thing in particular I want to note, which is the one way that the Medicaid regulatory definition is different from the Medicare definition of bona fide service fee, is the Medicaid definition includes a bunch of service fees that effectively are presumptively bona fide. And fan favorite, distributor service fees are included in the Medicaid definition as examples of a bona fide service fee, which is directly contrary to that prior slide where CMS said that certain distributor fees are presumptively non-bona fide. So even if CMS wants to harmonize these definitions, can it? How can it override that language, which in the AMP and best price definition, by the way, isn't something CMS made up. That's in the statute. If you look at the statutory definition of AMP, it includes a definition of bona fide service fee, and it includes that laundry list of fees as presumptively bona fide. So I don't know how CMS reconciles its position on ASP that distributor service fees that are percentage-based are presumptively non-bona fide with Congress's direction and the definition of AMP that they are bona fide. This position in the Medicare rule is also completely inconsistent with the government's point of position and a bunch of settlements that have been happening over the last decade where in the Medicaid context, a key TAM relator said that distributor service fees should be treated as bona fide service fees to raise AMP such that Medicaid rebates for those drugs would be higher. The allegation was that manufacturers artificially lowered their AMP by treating distribution fees as discounts, and that was fraud. And there have been a number of settlements. That is completely at odds with CMS's position now categorically that percentage-based fees for ASP should be discounts. The presumption. I mean, you can't get more opposite of that. So I don't know how CMS reconciles that either. And that goes along with it is it's hard to have it both ways. Lowering ASP by treating these fees as discounts saves Medicare money, but it's going to cost money on the Medicaid side because if you do the same thing there, it will lower AMP and that will lower rebate under both the basic and inflation penalty components of the rebate. And so will those savings more than offset the ASP changes? Did CMS even think about that when they proposed this rule? It's unclear. We talked about why this is going to change all of your agreements. So you might not only need to change them to have this reporting requirement, but it could change your fee structure, right? So if you have to pay a big fee because you have no choice and only some amount of that is bona fide, do you treat the rest of it as a discount? If so, do you convert it to a discount in the agreement and just call out as a fee in your wholesaler agreement that amount that qualifies as a bona fide service fee? And you might also need, and you're going to need, actually, not may, any agreement where any part of the fee you're viewing as a bona fide service fee, you're going to want to have that certification requirement so you can rely on that when you submit to CMS. Fair market value considerations. So fair market vendors are having more work than they could possibly do. And those services are about to get much more expensive because you need them. You need them like you never needed them before. You need them to do, and they're not paying me to say this, you need them to do the particular methodology that you need them to do. And that's important because, for example, not all fair market value vendors can do the cost-based methodology. A lot of them focus on market-based, but you need to find ones that do cost-based. You need to get in line to make sure that they're ready to look at all your agreements. And those vendors have to be independent, which means that they can't have any other financial relationship with you as a manufacturer. They can't be your GP vendor. They probably can't be your financial auditor. They really need to be independent. And so are we going to see the same thing that happened when the auditor independence rule came out, which is everyone is sort of shuffling through their fair market value vendors because the vendor that you can't use is someone that someone else can use. And so do you sort of cross-reference fair market value vendors to make sure everyone has someone who's independent? And those fair market value vendors actually have to make sure that they're okay with you submitting their fair market value determination, which they may be, but sometimes those agreements might say that those are private and you don't have the right to disclose them. So you have to make sure that they do. And as I mentioned before, I'm particularly concerned about the impact that this is going to have on manufacturers with smaller portfolios of products, because I just think the nature of the fees and the fact that they have to pay higher fees than they would prefer is going to drive more of their fees into being price concessions, lowering their ASP and disadvantaging their products, frankly, in the prescribing environment. And as I also mentioned, we want to make sure CMS confirms that that the only amount of the fee that you'd have to treat as a price concession is the amount over fair market value. So what do you need to do, and what do you need more time for? I mean, I guess maybe to make you feel better, the #1 comment that was submitted on this proposal was, we need more time. There is no blanking way we're going to be able to do this by Q1. And remember, CMS, that you make us certify our data under the penalty of perjury, and to put us in the position, to put a manufacturer in the position of having to come into compliance, get all this documentation in order, and do it in time to certify data in April is sort of setting someone up for enforcement. And so we hope to get more time. We'll see if we get more time, because this administration, I think, is very interested in showing savings in the nearer term, not the longer term. But in whatever time you have, if you haven't already done so, inventory all of your agreements where you're paying service fees that you want to treat them as bona fide. Contract with the fair market value vendors, make them your best friends, have them on auto dial, make sure that they're prepared to do the fair market value assessments you need using the methodology that we expect the regulation to permit. Revise those agreements as needed, including any certification of compliance with the pass-through prohibition. And then last but not least, worry about your GP calculations. Like, what do you have to do with your documentation? What do you have to do with your programming? What do you have to do with your own internal bona fide service fee process? Is there anything you're going to need to implement to allow for the potential differential treatment between a service fee arrangement and AMP and best price versus ASP? And then last but certainly not least, make sure that those folks in the business that are modeling ASP every quarter to see how provider acquisition costs marry up with ASP plus 6%, make sure that they're aware of this and modeling the heck out of the different scenarios. And of course, because I'm a lawyer, watch for legal challenges. I think that there's a lot of concern around some of the provisions here, and if it's finalized as proposed, I expect that there will be legal challenges to it. That's just topic #1. What's topic #2? I would say they get easier, they don't, they just get shorter. So bundled sales. So, you know, that rule back in December 2006 that CMS issued last time to talk about ASP, one of the things in that rule that CMS decided to do was not finalize and codify a definition of bundled sale for purposes of the ASP calculation. And instead, CMS said, use reasonable assumptions, and one reasonable assumption is to use the Medicaid definition. And by the way, as you may remember, the Medicaid definition of bundled sale now accounts for value-based purchasing arrangements, or VBPs. CMS has proposed to finally adopt and formalize a bundled sale definition for purposes of the ASP calculation. And what we have on the slide is a red line comparing the Medicare proposed definition with what the current Medicaid definition is, okay? I love that CMS cares enough about this rule that they changed any to an. They then added references to biologicals, which is fine because a lot of ASP drugs are biologicals, so that makes sense. And so that's in a couple of different places. They deleted contingency triggers across drugs of different types and drugs with different 9-digit NDC9s. Not quite sure why those had to be deleted. I don't think that they're inconsistent with what they want to do, but it just creates more differences between the Medicaid definition where that matters, right? Having bundles across different NDC9 matters for best price and AMP. And then they added in a couple more examples of what could trigger a bundled arrangement, which is different purchasing patterns and prior purchases without really explaining what that means or what they're trying to get to. But that's what they're proposing. They also have specifically said, and by the way, we're not including VBPs in bundled sales, even though Medicaid does, because we're still thinking about it. And they have some really interesting language in the preamble that goes to how Medicare views the Medicaid guidance on how to treat non-contingent discounts in bundled sales. So that's where we're going to start. So for those of us who were looking at this a decade ago, which is astonishingly small group of people in the audience, which makes me feel really old, there was a rulemaking where CMS revised the definition of bundled sales. And the hot topic, or one of the hot topics in that definition, was the treatment of non-contingent discounts. What's a non-contingent discount? A discount that the customer gets no matter what. So think of, you get 10% off of product A no matter what, you get another 10% off of product A if you buy product B. That first 10% is a non-contingent discount, the second 10% is contingent on the purchase of product B. When CMS first proposed the definition of bundled sale, they had language that suggested you had to reallocate both 10% in my example, such that the first 10%, even though you just got it on product A, could end up being moved in part to product B, okay? So not if you unbundled both. If you only unbundle this, so you can end up effectively, if products have the same WAC, you could end up with a, product B having 10% and product A having 10%. If you only unbundle the contingent discounts, you could end up with a situation where half of that second 10% goes to product B, but half stays on product A, and so you have 15 and 5. There was a lot of pushback from stakeholders saying, we don't think it makes any sense to have to reallocate non-contingent discounts, and CMS modified the definition accordingly. And they tweaked the language to say that you would have to reallocate the discounts in the bundle, including discounts from contingent arrangements, removed references to non-contingent, and stakeholders in general interpreted that to mean mandatory reallocation of non-contingent discounts is not required. Until CMS in preamble guidance discussing the proposed ASP definition, CMS says, well, we read that Medicaid guidance in the quoted language. In other words, as noted in that preamble guidance, the unbundling of both contingent and non-contingent discounts is appropriate because all discounts in the bundled arrangement should be proportionally allocated, effectively saying non-contingent discounts are definitely part of the bundle. There is going to be some disagreement in the stakeholder community around whether that is the right way to interpret the Medicaid definition, and so there's a lot of mischief around this. Through this Medicare ruling, is CMS telling us that we have to do something different from Medicaid than we were doing before. And that's something that I think a lot of people have concern around that. This addition of prior purchases and purchasing patterns, does this even expand the universe of products subject to being a bundled sale? Hard to know. If it does it only matter if the drug's an ASP drug? Do you not have to worry about those additional triggers if it's a Medicaid drug? So why we should care? If you have VBPs and they involve ASP and you currently treat them as bundles under the Medicaid definition, the question is, come Q1, do you get to treat them as bundles for purposes of ASP? Or are you going to treat them differently in Medicaid versus ASP because the ASP definition doesn't include VBPs? AMP and best price implications, we've talked about the non-contingent language and the other differences in what the potential triggers are. And the next steps are going to look very similar, right? Inventory all of your bundled sale arrangements that involve ASP products, evaluate whether you have any non-contingent discounts in them that you're not unbundling now, watch to see if you're going to have to start unbundling them, and if you do you only have to unbundle them for ASP and not for Medicaid? Do you have to revise any of your agreements to address the implications of what this is going to do to your calculations? Are you going to have to revise your calculations because you're going to end up having to treat bundles differently for ASP versus AMP and best price? And then, of course, model the impact. Last but not least is the mandatory reasonable assumption. So CMS has long permitted manufacturers to submit their reasonable assumptions for ASP, but has not required it. CMS, Medicaid, on the other hand, has actively discouraged manufacturers from submitting their reasonable assumptions. CMS on the ASP side, don't you just sort of want to say, can't we all get along? Can we just get the Medicaid people in the room with the Medicare people, make sure that they're talking? Anyway, CMS is proposing mandatory submission of ASP reasonable assumptions effective with your Q1 calculations. And CMS has said, we're going to create templates that you have to use, not just for your reasonable assumptions, but also for your fair market value documentation and also for your pass-through prohibition prong. Why should everyone care? Is CMS Medicaid going to make submissions mandatory now? Shouldn't it? I mean, it's just so schizophrenic to have such diametrically opposed views in those two programs. And now that your reasonable assumptions and your fair market value and certifications have to be submitted and certified by your certifier, what protocols are you going to have in place to make sure that your hundreds of pages of certifications and fair market value documentation is ready and can be submitted every quarter? And in turn, consider what those internal controls are going to be like. And last but not least, if you think this is just a paperwork exercise, I have convinced myself that CMS is going to release the bots on your submissions. And CMS is going to be using AI to review them to see how manufacturers do things differently. They're going to see who's giving you certifications for pass-through and who's not. They're going to be looking at whose fair market value is for distribution agreements. And is one vendor's fair market value different from another vendor's value? And when they do that, it's not just going to be manufacturers who are going to be audited. I think fair market value vendors are going to be audited, and I think people who sign pass-through certifications have the potential to be audited. So you do need to exercise extraordinary care around all of that to make sure you are completely comfortable, because I think that's what we're going to do in a post-Doge world around these numbers. Wait, there's more. You thought that was bad enough? Here are the topics that I don't even have time to get to. I'm sort of teeing this up for the fireside chat and other folks. There's room to, those categories where CMS has said these aren't service fees, there's room to engage substantively on why that's wrong. They've said that MFP has to be an ASP. I actually think they have discretion to include MFP and ASP. I think there's an argument that as a legal matter they can't. And they're not going to be publishing ASP-based payment rates going forward for the MFP drugs. They're just going to be publishing MFP payment rates. There's an identification for how they're going to identify and exclude 340B units from the Part D inflation rebates. There's some technical stuff on Part B inflation rebate benchmarks. And then on the OPPS rule, there's coming down on skin substitutes, reducing reimbursement to hospitals on 340B drugs through the Drug Price Acquisition Survey, and then really going to enforce the standard in the Medicaid statute that says you have to have a Medicaid agreement in order to have Part B reimbursement. Whew. I've finished in 40 minutes. So last but not least, I could not do this without this fantastic team. So my partner, I can't be in the fireside chat tomorrow because I've got to travel. My partner, Maura Kelson, who joined us from HHS, is going to be in the fireside chat tomorrow. Today, Sam and Kathleen are doing a breakout session on ASP, MFP effectuation for Part B drugs and inflation rebates, so go see them. And Mahmoud, who keeps us all sane, will be at the booth all day long. So thank you, team, and know that I'm just the talking head and they make it possible. Thanks, everyone.